Hey, this is Jack, and this video is called Does Jordan Peterson Have It Right? Hey, welcome to my channel. If you're new here or you haven't subscribed, I'd love to have you with us. We've got an amazing community of people here, and I release videos pretty much every week on personal growth, authenticity, and dating. And this video today is a little bit different. I actually wanted to take this topic as a way of discussing some of the perspectives or clash of perspectives that I think are really important at this time of being a human on earth. And my purpose in this video is not to persuade you one way or another. My purpose is actually to help demarcate, lay out some of the territory so that you can come to conclusions that feel good to you, or at least you might be able to be introduced to perspectives that you haven't fully been with in a way that maybe you can hear them. So I don't really have a dog in this fight, so to speak. Jordan Peterson is obviously an incredibly intelligent individual. I enjoy the way that he weaves in ideas from very disparate fields: science, psychology, myth, religion, gender. He's impressive in that way. And for those of you that don't know his work, I'll put a link beneath this video to his channel. You can check him out. He kind of rose to prominence in the last several years. He wrote a best-selling book that sold over 2 million copies, I think, worldwide. And he also found himself at the sort of edge, the hard edge of our culture wars, right? And it's that really, that edge that I want to talk to a little bit today. Now, I haven't talked about this a lot in public, so kind of go gentle on me. This is not something that's super well rehearsed in me. It feels important to me that we do better in some of our conversations, that we are polarized in some ways, and some of that polarization, in my sort of big view of how we're unfolding, is actually fine. It's actually the right direction for us. And on the other side of that polarization, I think there will be a move towards more integration. You know, it's almost like there's a little bit of breakdown perhaps before there's a rebuilding. But there are also some pernicious consequences of this polarization in terms of people feeling disconnected from one another, in terms of people very quickly disrespecting one another, in terms of, in blunt ways, you look at something like the US and the political landscape, about half the people basically not understanding the other half of the people. And for those of us that might be willing to be with a little bit more nuance and complexity, it could be that it's incumbent upon us to actually start the reintegration of some of these polarized worldviews, or at least to be able to say, hey, I come down more on this side, or I come down very firmly on this side, but I can get what someone's trying to point to, or I get why they might be making that argument, rather than othering, right? You're stupid, you're crazy, you're immoral. It's kind of easy to go down that route. It's actually harder to try and empathize and be with someone's experience, and someone's experience obviously may have been very different to yours. So this is actually a good point of departure. It's to do with subjective experience. Now, if you've been on my channel for any amount of time, you know I talk a lot about revealing your experience or owning your experience, realizing that in any kind of relationship, intimate or otherwise, there are two people who are having two different experiences. And part of the culture wars that I see has to do with what right do you have to your subjective experience. I have lived in subcultures where there is an increasing broad cultural assumption that you are the authority on your subjective experience and I'm the authority on my subjective experience. You know best, even if you're sometimes out to lunch, so to speak, or you're not present to yourself, or you have, unconsciousness or unconscious roles or parts. But just putting that aside a little bit, you know what you're feeling inside. You know what you're sensing in your body, right? It's hard for me to know that you've got a buzzing right now in your left calf, but you know that. It's hard for me to know that you've got pain in your rib cage, but you know that. It's hard for me to know, we went to a dinner party. How did you actually experience it? Was it fun for you? Maybe I know that because I can look at some, correlates in your experience and your face and your gestures and your general demeanor. But there might also be that you were in a persona of enjoying the experience, but actually underneath you felt lonely or like you wanted to be at home watching Netflix. Right? And this is the beauty of the more we can reveal our experiences to one another, we actually build intimacy, we get to know each other at a deeper level. So why am I talking about this? Is because recently, for example, if you look at the Harry and Meghan interview, right, created lots of storm, so to speak, worldwide, interview with Oprah, and Piers Morgan, who's a British TV presenter, was let go by his show, or he kind of resigned, but I think he was sort of forced to resign because he was of the view that Meghan wasn't telling the truth. Now, I'm not here to talk about whether Meghan was telling the truth or not. I'm here to say that Meghan, in this worldview, is the authority on Meghan's experience. So if she says, I felt trapped, at some level, that's her experience. She gets to have that. And it's not really for any of us to say, well, no, how could she feel trapped? How could this wealthy princess feel trapped? It's like anyone can feel trapped, whether you're super rich or super poor. Right? That's just part of being a human and having a human experience, I think. So I'm putting that out there because one of the arguments that Jordan Peterson talks about is, what is primary? Is the individual primary, or is the group identity primary? And he's of the view that the individual is primary, that almost the great achievements, if they are those, of Western civilization is to do with the rights of the individual, right? The sort of things that might be enshrined in a constitution or in a Bill of Rights, the right to free speech, the right to freedom of conscience, the right to think and believe what you want to believe, the right to your own religion or no religion, and so on. And he's also a student of totalitarianism, right? So he studied Stalinism, he studied Maoism, he studied probably lots of other totalitarianisms that are less in the kind of global public consciousness. And so he knows kind of at a deep level some of the dangers, as he sees it, of the primacy of the group identity. He's like, I kind of know where that leads. Now, perhaps the question is, people who are advocating, right? So Jordan Peterson rose to global prominence in some ways on the back of a specific piece of legislation that was passed in one of the Canadian provinces that was to do with the mandated use of personal pronouns. That is, that if I will have a personal pronoun that is different than the pronoun that you might ascribe to me by just looking at me, or is a different pronoun than a pronoun that was used growing up, or is different than he and she, that maybe it's they, maybe it's ze, maybe it's something else. Who has the right to dictate whether that's get used? Can I have the right to say, yes, you need to use this to me, you need to use this in reference to me, or is that effectively your choice? And even though he would say in polite society that wherever possible, we should honor the pronoun that someone wants us to use, he says it's dangerous if the law starts to mandate that use. And so this became a whole, big ongoing debate. And I think in his mind, there's a slippery slope that goes from, if the state, the government, can start to mandate the use of certain codes of speech. And by the way, if you dig into this, there are certain ways that speech is regulated, right? They give the examples of, you can't just go into an airport and say bomb, you can't just go into a theater and shout fire. There are some restrictions on free speech, so that's acknowledged. But for this one, he thinks that where this goes eventually is probably in this direction of totalitarianism, and that really scares him. So he sees this as the thin end of the wedge. I wonder if actually totalitarianism is the real danger in a postmodern society. Part of this comes down to, he's quite critical of postmodernists, and some of his criticisms may be fair. I'm actually not really in the detail of all those arguments, but it seems to me that there were not totalitarian regimes that were trying to protect the rights of trans people. So I think we're actually in new territory, and maybe we have to learn from history, but we also sometimes have to, and we don't want to get complacent about that. But also I think we evolve to different levels of reality and consciousness. And I think there is a consciousness in the desire to honor the rights of all people, even if at times it may infringe upon certain other rights, or we may have, in order to find where the sort of the right center point of something, we might have to push. This is sort of like an argument for affirmative action, right? We might have to push almost further, and in some ways, perhaps at times be discriminatory to the people who've historically had it better, in order to find the place where everyone's freedoms and everyone's rights are honored. So, is he right? I think the question I'd want to invite you is, well, what identity is primary? Is the individual primary, or is the group primary? In Western consciousness, I think we are more at the side of the individual, right? There's obviously huge advantages to that, but I also think there are some disadvantages, and one of them possibly might be, if you look at which countries seem to have handled COVID better, it seems that countries that have a more collectivist mindset, even if to a Western sensibility that might be at the expense of some individual liberties, that they have actually handled COVID a lot better in terms of numbers of people infected and dying, and also how quickly they've been able to return to some semblance of their normal day-to-day life. So, is actually that better, and that we do want a primacy in a group identity? I don't know the answer to that. What I know from my work is it's been a lot around relaxing my own identity and helping other people relax their identities in ways that don't serve them, right? When you have an unconscious identity as the peacemaker, the rebel, the giver, the overgiver, the overgiver, some of you, that's often, it restricts your behavior, right? Because there is a strong force in us that wants to be consistent with our identities. And so being able to relax your identity, or being able to treat your identity like items of clothing in the wardrobe, where you say, okay, cool, I want to put that one on today, and put that down, and put this one on. Like, consciously adopting personas or identities is different than unconsciously being identified with them. So when I hear this, I don't know if I want to say, well, one is definitively primary. It seems to me there are times that we need to assert our individual identities, and I've definitely been a lot in that world, and there are times where we want to be a member of a group. If I said to you, are you an individual? What's more important, yourself or your family? Do you want a definitive answer to that? Maybe there's times where, it's actually a bit more about you, and you're, I don't know, qualifying as an accountant, and you've got to just keep your head down, and that's your focus. Maybe you've got a young family, and absolutely that family identity is primary. Maybe your kids have gone off to college, and you are refinding the primacy of your individual identity, or creating a new identity. Maybe when you're at work in the day, you're a little bit more in your individual identity, and in the evening, you're a little bit more in your family identity. And that's just individual and family, but we're obviously part of these, it's almost like Russian dolls. They've got all these concentric and in some ways overlapping and at times competing identities, right? You are an individual, you are potentially a sibling, you're potentially a parent, you might be a worker or a co-worker, you might be a business owner, you might be a shareholder, you might be a community member, you might be a counselor, you might hold office, you're a member of perhaps a religion. Within that, you're a member of a specific church. You're perhaps part of an ethnic group. Maybe you're part of a national group. Maybe you feel like you're a global citizen. I mean, these are all different identities. Now, I get what he's saying is, if you get so fixated that everything you always see is through a group identity, that might be problematic. I also think if you only can see things only as an individual, that's also problematic. So it might just be that at our best, we're not locked into one of these things so strongly that we can't put it down. But if I can never get into the notion of a group identity or a group view, there's probably certain truths I'm not going to be able to be in touch with. And if you've had the experience that as a member of a particular group, that group is often victimized, problematized, disrespected, undervalued, or even persecuted, you might not know what that experience is like until you're a member of that group. And it might be that if we're talking about immutable characteristics like skin color, you may never know what that experience is, right? So this comes back to with the Meghan Markle thing. I think is interesting is, how do you know what someone else's experience is? How do you know where their individual and group is showing up, right? Someone may have never had the experience of really feeling like an individual because they're so into the particular group, they're so dedicated to their tribe, whatever that is. And the question seems to then be, how much space can I have for your subjective experience, and that I may not ever know exactly what it's like to walk in your shoes. Now, if that's used as a way of ongoingly silencing someone, I think that could be problematic also, right? So the best I can probably do is to learn about what it's like to be in your shoes, to show care and curiosity and empathy, and hopefully that's a mutual process. And it might be that at certain times it's actually not a mutual process because even if maybe we can make the best progress together where that is somewhat true, perhaps because of historic iniquities and discrimination, perhaps actually the majority of that sensitivity and listening is going to be in particular directions. And I think that's also probably okay and necessary for our evolution. So another thing that I just want to name here, so Jordan Peterson is often, he's often in debate, conflict possibly, with people whose worldview includes a critique of the patriarchy. And his rebuttal of that seems to be that it's, I think he thinks it's a very misrepresentative way to look at Western civilization, let's say. And I think one piece of his argument is to do with competence. So he says that actually what people are calling patriarchy, he sees as hierarchies of competence, that actually the ability to progress into more responsibility, say in your career, in most situations is based upon competence. It's not based upon immutable characteristics. And that actually, I think his fear is that the baby is going to get chucked out with the bathwater, so to speak, so that if everything is just looked at through this lens of patriarchy, what is good over history or what has been hard fought and won is kind of lost because it's all sort of tainted with this particular way of looking at things. Now, the reality may be that sometimes you have to chuck the baby out with the bathwater, that actually developmentally you don't really have an option not to do that. In the same way that in the world that I move in the coaching world, oftentimes if you're going to make a certain developmental move, you're going to have to push off against something, right? So if there's any truth in the patriarchal analysis, and I happen to think there is, then it may be that as we do that pushing off, it might be that we're going to push off against some things that ultimately, once certain battles in society have been won, we actually could return to with a bit more nuance. But whether you can do that on the front end, I don't think that's how it actually works typically. In my own world of helping people one-on-one, if there's an energy that you're not in touch with, let's say anger, and you're going to start befriending your anger, it's probably going to be messy. It's hard to do that just cleanly. It's like, yes, you're probably going to be in touch with more anger than you ever realized. At some point you might go too far and act out your anger, or you might burn a bridge that you then have to rebuild, or maybe you can't rebuild. It's not easy to do development, whether that's individually or collectively. Is every hierarchy in every organization purely built on competence? I don't think so. I went to what was historically an all-boys school in England, and when I was there, we celebrated what I think was our 900th anniversary. And since that time, the school has it went part co-ed, boys and girls, and then fully co-educational. And that move was resisted by a lot of people. It was also championed by other people. And I know from my experience of that, and from going to Cambridge, and from circles that I moved in my 20s, that there was definitely a thing called the Old Boys Network. Now, I didn't particularly want to be part of that. That wasn't super my scene, to be honest. And it's also opening up. So it wasn't just an old boys network. It was actually an old members network. But those things exist. To imagine that every person gets a job, for instance, based on their competence alone, that seems kind of naive to me, even though I think we are way more meritocratic probably than we've been at nearly any other point in history, talking in broad strokes. So I think he's trying to defend some things that might be worth in the fullness of time defending. I sense that he seems quite attached in some ways to this idea that it's about competence, and I think it would be good to include that the competence piece more in conversations, right, and not just to see it as all. Well, let me say this a bit differently. I think what we have in society is these different sort of worldviews and levels of development and consciousness. So there's a traditional worldview, which would be much more like this old boys network, which would be where perhaps older white men in Western countries are mostly running the show. And that is sort of sitting alongside a more meritocratic world that's coming into form, where we are over time reducing glass ceilings, where most organizations have more diversity and care more about diversity, even though there's a long way to go. And those things sort of coexist, right? In the same way that, you have a world that includes Scandinavia and a lot of postmodern values and sort of social democratic welfare systems. You have the sort of Anglo-American modernity that places a lot of primacy on, rule of law and commerce and democracy. And that also sits alongside countries that have a much more traditional worldview, where perhaps only recently in Saudi Arabia are women starting to get the right to drive, right? Which to a Western sensibility would seem, quite strange. And that's all part of the world, right? And that I'm talking about it very simply as if it's different within each of those countries. It's happening, right? Within each community, probably within yourself at times. So there's complexity there. And, our RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she passed last year. A lot of her career was dedicated to showing that actually we're not in a meritocratic society, that there were lots of laws that had to be changed. Now, we've come a long way. We've probably still got a long way to go. So we're somewhere on that journey. But to imagine that all organizations are meritocratic, I think is wrong. To imagine all organizations are only patriarchal may be wrong. The truth is most organizations are probably going to have some of both and some of more than that. Now, he will point to the data, I think is coming from countries within Scandinavia, I think in part, where he'll say, well, actually, what happens when you give people a choice, when you give men and women a choice about career, actually, a lot of the gender stereotypes are not just reinforced, they increase, right? So you have, for example, more men wanting to be engineers and more women wanting to be nurses. And I'm massively simplifying I have not read these in the original, so forgive me for that. But that's how he talks about them, and that this is then sort of upsetting to people because that's not what they imagine. They imagine it should sort of go the other way. But that's also a particular consciousness in those countries. I've not lived in those countries. So, maybe that gets replicated in other places. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's hard to know what the impact of narratives that are reinforced from a young age, familiarly, culturally, educationally. I mean, there's just a lot of vectors in that territory. And I think what we want is a situation where everyone, if they wanted to pursue being a CEO, that everyone has the possibility to pursue that, right? Obviously, in more hierarchical structures, we can't have everyone being CEO all the time, but that there is a genuine equality of playing field, which is not just to do with, do you have the rights to go to this university or to that training scheme? It's also in the subjective, right? It's in the intersubjective, which is a way of talking about culture. So it's in the things that we incentivize, it's in the norms, it's in the ways that we respect and disrespect, value, devalue, and those things are incredibly subtle. When he talks about the competence piece as his kind of pushback on patriarchy, my experience is that he's defensive. Now, he's also come under a huge amount of fire, so yeah, kind of wouldn't wish that on anyone. And I think you can make the argument about competence, and I think you can also make some arguments about things in our history and traditions that may be worth preserving. So we don't go to a sort of anarchy, and we don't go to just let's burn everything down, whilst also acknowledging, for example, that the statues that we keep in society do perhaps point to certain types of people or certain sectors of society that are hugely represented, and large swathes of society that are hugely underrepresented. And even if historically, it's fair to judge someone by their times, right? That we all live in a social, cultural context, that we may also say, but from our modern perspective, because we're placing so much emphasis on building a more equal society or eradicating slavery or coming to more justice in racial relations, that we are going to take measures to show that we care about that by actually changing the emphasis that we put in our statues, right? To me, those things can coexist. I think what's difficult is that the arguments that are being made to come to terms with things in our past that to our now modern and pre-modern sensibilities are not okay. It's like, how is that done? And sometimes it needs, to create change, you need a fiery activist vanguard. But sometimes where they want to go might be further than where is actually best, or is actually truest. But maybe you need a little bit of that energy sometimes to break through and to actually create the momentum to make something happen. The other thing I'd say that I'd like to hear him talk about more when the arguments about patriarchy come up is how does he know what someone else's subjective experience is, right? So I don't think we should shut him up just because he is an older white man. That doesn't disavow everything that he has to say and doesn't disavow his experience. But does he actually know from the inside, in the same way that I don't know from the inside, what is it like to be, say, a woman in an organization having the experience that your way of looking at the world, that your opinion, that your skill set and character isn't valued, and that in your experience, that is because you are a woman, or part of that is because you are a woman, and perhaps when you talk with other women, they get what you're talking about quite easily because they have a similar experience. That doesn't seem contentious to me. Now, the conclusions of, well, where does your subjective experience then meet objective reality and things that we might want to change in terms of organizational structures and policies, I get that is more contentious, how that translation happens. But I think that translation, or for us to come to better ways of doing things together, is easier if I can start with acknowledging that you do have a right to your subjective experience. Where it can start to get tricky is if you're talking about something from your subjective experience that starts to look like data, science, objective reality, as much as we can apprehend objective reality. And that, I think, creates some fear in people whose worldview is very rooted in facts, data, science, that's where they go to, you know? So if you listen to certain conservative commentators that might have some sympathy with Jordan Peterson, they may have the experience themselves. So their subjective experience, like for example, earlier I was listening to Candace Owens, her experience as a young black woman is that, yes, there are historic inequities, but it hasn't stopped her overcoming that and creating success in her life. And therefore, with the individual as kind of the primary unit of experience and reality, we actually want to empower people with that narrative, right? And whilst I think she's trying to help people with that, like, God, yeah, if I've climbed a certain mountain, even if it was really hard, I want to imagine that you can, and I want to be like a living proof and role model or help you. And if I see you have a mindset that I think is getting in the way, I might think you're disempowering yourself. But actually, that's my experience. What's your experience? So my experience, as in that instance, her experience as a young black woman might be very different from your experience as a young black woman. And we don't want to, we talk a lot on this channel, we don't want to subjectify each other. We don't want to imagine that because I've walked a certain path, that you can walk a certain path, or you should want to walk a certain path, or the obstacles on your path are going to be the same to my path. But also, just because I am, you know, let's own my experience, because I am a white male, that I can start to speak for all white men. That just doesn't make sense to me also. Now, might it be that part of our experience is somewhat more shared than someone who's not a man and is not white? That might be true. I just think we need to have enough sort of nuance to honor the individual narratives, while also we sometimes need to be able to cut through that and say, yes, great, honor the individual narratives, and if there is a dominant group experience, maybe there is something that we need to really value about that group perspective. The difficulty is that there are probably going to be multiple group perspectives within any particular group identity, you know? So this is where if one way of talking about a group experience kind of dominates, it might be that a lot of people are actually being missed out in that way of doing things. Again, though, it might be that, yes, that's true, and it's enough of a deal that we need to create enough change from it that it's actually okay to talk about this is the dominant experience of being a particular gender or race or, you know, member of a religion, fill in the blank. So I also have a little bit of space around that, you know, that it's, we can't honor everything all the time, always, right? We're always having to simplify or prioritize something in order to create change, because change is already complex and often there are unintended consequences of change. But I think just having the space where it's like, you know, you tell me your story, I'll tell you mine, where that's okay. And that even your way of, I don't try and combat your story by facts. You know, I don't say, well, you can't have the experience of feeling disadvantaged because actually 20 years ago we passed a law, so the thing you're talking about doesn't apply. If your experience is, okay, maybe legally there is some standard that went into law, but we all know that law and culture aren't the same thing. So laws can be passed and cultures and prejudices can persist. You know, if you have the experience that, let's say you're renting and you've had lots of experiences of landlords that have been difficult, maybe it doesn't matter that the law in theory protects you fully, or is even perhaps now in some places in favor of the tenant, some people might say. If your experience is, yeah, I've had bad experiences with landlords, they haven't treated me well, that's your experience. And I don't get to negate your experience by saying, sorry, the law. That they're two different things. You know, it's just like I don't get to negate your experience of, you know, if I cook you a meal and you say, oh, that's really tasty, or actually I didn't enjoy it, I don't just get to say, here's the recipe, as if somehow the recipe determines every part of your experience. So I think it's a good thing that over time we're becoming more comfortable with including forms of subjective experience. I do think that's a developmental move culturally, and I think there is a bit of a culture war between people who accept that and kind of cherish it and people who deny that. And I think over time, the number of people that deny the realm of subjective experience may go down. Here's the risk, though. The more we honor subjective experience, in some ways, the less we honor science. It takes a bit of complexity to be able to be with both of those things. That's why I think a lot of the rationalists and the pro-science, and even maybe you could throw in there at times the pro-vaccination people, I think that's why they're concerned, because the more you honor subjective experience, the less we're in one dominant narrative about what is true, right? So it does create a multiplicity of truths. And to some people, the notion that there's a multiplicity of truths is absolutely abhorrent. It's stupid. But if we can get to the space where you have your subjective experience, I have mine, necessarily there's a multiplicity of personal truths. Now, that might be different than a scientific truth, right? Which is something that we can replicate verifiably, objectively, you know, and we all know that not every study that's done in the name of science is funded only for the truth. But we might talk about my truth, your truth, his truth, our truth, their truth. To some people, that's going to be a very strange way of talking. To you, that might make sense because you get, yeah, actually, I have my experience and you have yours. And actually, in relationship, that's a very powerful position to be in, that differentiation, so that I'm not just imagining that because I'm upset, you should be upset, or because I went to lay down, that's the same reason that you went to lay down, or if you're silent, that's the same reason that I would be silent, and that would mean this, and therefore that. You know, we kind of cuddle that out. We say, you have your experience, tell me. We try and minimize our assumptions. Now, do we do that all the time? Of course not. Do I do that all the time? Of course not, right? There's always times when you have heuristics, right? You've shortcuts on people, you imagine things, but at our best, when we're resourced and we have the time and energy, I think that's what we can do, and we're better for it. And I think we need more of that coming into our civic and political discourse so that we can hear, you know, what is it like? Okay, what is it like for you being a Native American? What is your experience? And getting really curious and caring about that. What is your experience as a teenager? Getting curious about that. What's your experience of being an elder? Getting curious about that. What's your experience as a trans person? And getting really curious about that. And that I have enough, how is that? It's almost like I have the sort of the strength or the authenticity in myself that it's not, I don't need to defend against your experience. I don't need to defend against the way that you experience reality, even if it's so different. Maybe it's even so different that I can't even make sense of it. So there's a public intellectual, I guess, Jonathan Haidt. I've seen him talk on, you know, various podcast interviews. I have not read him in the original, but I've heard him talk about his work. And one of the ideas that stuck with me, and I'm going to approximate here, I don't know this in detail, but he talks about our sensibilities, even maybe our moral sensibilities, in the same way that we might talk about taste buds, right? So we have taste buds for sweet and sour and astringent. And the notion would be that some of us have kind of enlarged taste buds in certain directions. So he has different vectors. I think he's talking about morality. He may also talk about politics, you know, but the extent to which, let's say, we like order, that's almost a taste bud, which means it's almost something we don't choose. It's just something that we experience easily, right? Let's say a desire for order. And that is going to have political consequences. It perhaps will make you more likely to be more right-wing on the political spectrum, that desire for order. But you didn't really choose it. It kind of chose you, right? Just in the same way that most of our immutable characteristics we didn't choose, you know? So why am I saying that? Well, because it's easier if I just say, look, randomly, you are a conservative. You didn't really choose that. Maybe you sat down, read the sort of political philosophy canon, and decided conservative principles make the most sense for you. Maybe, that's possible. My imagination is that for a lot of us, it's just almost a priori that we have certain proclivities. For some of us, we really like the open-mindedness and tolerance of the liberal worldview, or perceived tolerance. And so it's just kind of natural for us to orient that way. So when I understand that, oh, okay, basically you and I, in our subjective experience, we have different taste buds, or certain taste buds get activated more easily, maybe then we can have a little bit more appreciation for our difference. Rather than it being like, well, you're dumb or crazy, it's like, oh, you're just parsing reality for different vectors of reality than I'm parsing, and neither of us is choosing that. It's actually choosing us to some extent. And maybe over time, the practice is to learn to complete our palate, so to speak, which means, can I learn to value, let's say, astringent tastes that historically I've just not had any interest in, or they haven't even shown up, or perhaps they've even shown up as more like a negative taste. Can I learn to be a little bit more neutral, or can I learn to understand, well, okay, when someone values order, what's good about that? What's good about that? Okay, right, stability, okay, that's a good thing. Or, yeah, order has some relationship with crime. That's an important relationship. So we start to relax. The thing that sometimes surprised me, I'm a politics major. I did really well in my politics finals at Cambridge, and it still sometimes surprises me how sure people are of their politics. Like how convinced they are that they're right and everyone else is dumb. Not everyone else, but about half the people. And in the integral worldview, we sort of start with this premise: no one's 100% right, but no one's 100% wrong. Generally, there's something that people are honoring that's important, even if it's just 1 or 2% or 10% of the picture. And from that perspective, now I can start to find, well, what is the 1, 2, 10, 50, 100, probably not 100, 70% that could be right in the thing that you're saying, or the things that you're valuing? It just creates a lot more space. And I would love for there to be a lot more of that sort of space and curiosity in the conversations, because I think we need that skill to kind of get us where it is that we need to go. I'll say one last thing. This isn't so specific to Jordan Peterson. It's specific to some of the territory of these sort of culture wars conversations. Facts don't care about your feelings, right? This is something that conservative commentator Ben Shapiro says a lot, and it's sort of become a mantra of certain people on the right. And what's good about that is that it points to this realm that says, like even like a scientific realm, that what you feel about something doesn't change the way that the observable data is, right? And that's a partial perspective that I think is really important. Now, the inverse is also true and important as well. Feelings don't care about your facts. So in my subjective experience, I'm having a feeling, probably a set of feelings about you, life, reality, the government, taxes, you name it. And once we get comfortable with honoring that our subjective experience is, we're an authority on that and it's important, I think it follows from that I'm going to have certain feelings that you can't just explain through facts, or you can't just disregard because they don't align with the facts. Now, I get that there's a space here. So, let's say you were really upset that I drove your car without permission, but actually the fact is that I didn't. And therefore, I might have the view that if you really knew the facts, you actually wouldn't be having this feeling, right? So I think there is some realm there that I get, and that I think the facts don't care about your feelings, guys, that they're kind of fighting for that. But I also think they're very comfortable in sort of saying, basically, your feelings don't matter. And I actually think your feelings really do matter. That's not to say that your feelings are going to be constant. In authentic emotional experience, we talk a lot about, things arising and falling, that I'm not attached to my disappointment, that I can feel it and let it go. But often there's a message in there that's important. And if we're talking about, do I feel connected to other people? Do I feel part of a nation or global family? That feeling is important, and it's not just rational. So yeah, there's more to it than rationality. For those of us that are feelings first, I think we can develop by acknowledging that sometimes when we have strong feelings about things, we may start to overlook the facts, right? We may take the feelings as if they were facts. Because I feel so strongly about this, it must therefore be true that XYZ. What might be true is I feel really strongly about this. Whether the facts that sort of drop down from feeling that way are true, that's a different question. And I think that's actually some of the value of some of the really data-oriented thinkers that they're bringing, is they're like, yes, we might have a set of typical feelings about this, but let's not conflate that with what the data is actually showing us. So again, it's space, it's creating room for these things to coexist. And that I don't just want to dismiss you because you're feeling a certain way. It's actually like, well, let's start there, because it's much harder to be with facts that might in some ways contradict how I'm feeling if there's no space for you to acknowledge that I'm feeling this way, right? We saw this with Brexit. A lot of people were having the feeling that their community was changing, and there wasn't in some ways space for them to feel that without being labeled as, small Englanders or little Englanders, racists. And of course, there's going to be a faction where maybe it is true to say that that is a racist perspective. But there might also be true that actually communities that change really quickly and don't have a lot of attention put into how to integrate people well, that changes how people feel about their community. And some of the data would actually back that up to say, wow, if this is like suddenly there's 40% of people new here in the last period of time, even if those people, let's just take it out of any kind of transnational migration, even if 40% of people came from another part of your country, here in Boulder, here in liberal Boulder, Colorado, I hear people getting upset about how many Californians are living here, how many people are coming up from Texas, so it's not just it's a racial thing, it's communities are changing, and pros and cons of that, but we want to have a space to be able to say, well, what is the sort of the truth of how someone is experiencing something? And maybe I'm not saying that in the best language. Let's understand your experience. It may be that your experience is gonna ramify into some perspectives that you're holding as true that aren't actually fully true. But let's start with what you're feeling. What you're feeling is things are changing. And what does that feel like? Yeah, I'm afraid. Okay, so can I be with the fact that you have some fear that things are changing fast without just saying Luddite or get over it or don't be racist? It's like, let's start and honor with that. And then we can actually get into, well, what is actually happening? And, am I parsing reality in the fact realm with more or less accuracy? Maybe I'm not, because I've had so much feelings I haven't been able to metabolize, because no one will ever listen to me because I just get labeled, right? That's hard. So that's where I think we can go with this, where we actually make it okay for people to be feeling what they're feeling, even sometimes if what they're feeling is some anger. Maybe even at times I'm feeling really, disappointed, disgruntled, even if I would go so far as sometimes to say we might be feeling a little bit hateful. I don't know anyone that doesn't at times have some version of, hate, which is really often associated with an experience that I'm powerless to change something. It's kind of like, who's going to cast the first stone? I think a lot of us have an experience. We maybe not label it that, right? We might label it as something else. We might say, I'm being snide. Okay, that's the sort of acceptable front end of what you might call hate. Anyway, I don't want to get too far into that topic because I think it's its own kind of emotive thing. I'm just saying that the more we honor our own real deep experiences of what's actually happening, the easier, just like any shadow, right? The more I acknowledge my shadow, the more I can be with your shadow. The more I acknowledge my darkness, the more I can be with yours. Now we're having more of an integral conversation, because we're acknowledging that, yeah, I don't just bring love and light to the territory of my political discourse. I actually bring a full and complex set of emotions as a human being, trying to make sense of a world that is changing around me, and that most of us, and I'll hold my hand up, sometimes it's really hard to make sense of where we're at in the world, or where we're going, or is that even a good thing? So I'm going to hit pause there, because I've said quite a lot. If there's ways that I've spoken that aren't as nuanced as they could be, my apologies. I'm learning, I'm doing my best. If there's something that you want to educate me on, my invitation would be do that in a way that's the easiest for me to hear and for other people to hear as well. And yeah, if you like this video, I'm going to link this first video underneath this. It's a video about how to be yourself, but it's an extension of some of this sort of territory, so you might want to check that out if you've liked the flavor of this. And as always, questions and comments beneath this video. I look forward to hearing your experiences. Also, I want to know, like, what are you struggling to make sense of in the world? Whether that's something that's civic or political, or it's there's so many things that are going on in the world that seem difficult to come to terms with. Criminal justice reform, the rates of suicide. Like, what are the things that have either touched you personally in your life, or that you're worried or concerned about, or that you don't really see a way forward with? I'd love to know what's burdening you, in case there's any way that I or we as a community can help, or if there's things that you want me to look into further or to talk to. I would love to know. So open invitation to share that. And as always, I'm Jack. Thanks for being here.